The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church like 1,000 accusatory fingers. It was late October in Brooklyn, New York, and the streets glistened with oil and regret. Inside the old cathedral, the air smelled of incense, candle wax, and something heavier, something unspoken, the kind of silence that holds secrets. Antonio Ricci sat alone in the last pew, his calloused hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was 34 years old, but his eyes belonged to a much older man. Dark circles framed them, born from sleepless nights and memories that refused to fade. His leather jacket was soaked through, clinging to his broad shoulders like a second skin. Water dripped from his hair onto the wooden bench, each drop echoing in the vast emptiness of the church. For years, Antonio had been a soldier in the Sicilian Mafia, a low-level enforcer who did what he was told without question. He collected debts, delivered messages, and when necessary made problems disappear. It was a life built on loyalty and fear, two pillars that had kept him standing even when his conscience tried to pull him down. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed. The job was supposed to be simple: intimidate a store owner who owed money to the family, show him the price of disrespect. Antonio had done it 100 times before, but when he and his partner Vinny arrived at the small Italian deli in Red Hook, they found more than they bargained for. The owner, Mr. Castellano, an elderly man with trembling hands and kind eyes, refused to pay. He had already given everything he had to his daughter's medical bills. He begged for more time. Vinny didn't care. He raised his gun. Antonio told him to wait, to think, but Vinny was young and eager to prove himself. The argument escalated. Mr. Castellano tried to run. In the chaos, Vinny fired. The old man collapsed behind the counter, his blood spreading across the white tiles like spilled wine. But what haunted Antonio most wasn't the violence. It was the sound. Before he died, Mr. Castellano whispered a prayer. A simple, desperate prayer to a God Antonio had forgotten. That prayer followed Antonio everywhere. It echoed in his dreams, whispered in the silence of his apartment, and screamed at him in the moments between heartbeats. He tried to drown it with alcohol, bury it with work, but nothing helped. The weight of that innocent man's death crushed him slowly, relentlessly, until he could no longer breathe under its pressure. So tonight Antonio came to St. Michael's, not because he believed in miracles, but because he had nowhere else to go. The church was a relic from another era, its stone walls scarred by time and history. Most people avoided it now, preferring the modern megachurches uptown. But Antonio remembered this place from his childhood, back when his grandmother would drag him to Sunday Mass, back when the world still made sense. He stood slowly, his legs heavy as lead, and walked toward the confessional booth at the side of the church. The wooden structure was old, its dark panels worn smooth by decades of guilt-ridden hands. A small cross hung above the entrance, catching the flicker of candlelight. Antonio hesitated, his hand hovering over the curtain. What was he doing here? Could words erase blood? Could confession wash away sin? But the weight in his chest demanded release. He pulled the curtain aside and stepped into the narrow booth, sitting down on the hard wooden bench. On the other side of the screen he could make out a silhouette, a priest, waiting patiently in the darkness. Antonio took a deep breath, and for the first time in weeks he spoke the truth. On the other side of the confessional screen sat Father Luca Romano, though Antonio didn't know his name. Father Luca was 41 years old, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples and eyes that had seen too much of both worlds, the sacred and the profane. He wore his priestly collar with quiet dignity, but beneath the fabric lay scars that told a different story. 20 years ago, Luca Romano had been someone else entirely. He wasn't a man of God, he was a man of blood. Born into the Romano crime family, Luca grew up in the shadow of his older brother Matteo, who was groomed from birth to lead. Their father, Giovanni Romano, ruled Brooklyn's underworld with an iron fist, and both boys were expected to follow in his footsteps. Matteo embraced it. Luca resisted. While Matteo learned the art of intimidation and control, Luca found solace in books, philosophy, and the quiet corners of their neighborhood church. He watched his father order executions over dinner and saw his brother carry them out with cold efficiency. The violence didn't make Luca strong, it broke something inside him. By the time he was 18, Luca knew he couldn't live that life. He had to choose between family and soul. The night Luca told his father he was leaving to join the seminary, Giovanni struck him across the face so hard he fell to the floor. Matteo stood in the doorway, silent and watchful. Their father called Luca a coward, a traitor, a disgrace to the Romano name. But Luca didn't fight back. He simply stood, packed a single bag, and walked out into the night. He never looked back. The family disowned him. To them, Luca Romano was dead. But Father Luca was born, a man who believed that redemption was possible, even for those drowning in darkness. He studied at the seminary, took his vows, and dedicated his life to serving those the world had abandoned. Eventually, he returned to Brooklyn, not to his family, but to St. Michael's Church, where he offered forgiveness to anyone who sought it. He hadn't spoken to Matteo in over 15 years. He heard stories, of course. Everyone in Brooklyn knew Matteo Romano. The younger brother had risen through the ranks after their father's death, becoming one of the most feared bosses in the city. Matteo's name was whispered in alleys and shouted in courtrooms. He was ruthless, calculating, and utterly loyal to the code their father had drilled into them. And somewhere deep in Luca's heart, beneath the prayers and the collar, there was still love for his brother, twisted, painful, but undeniable. Now, sitting in the confessional booth, Father Luca listened as Antonio began to speak. The enforcer's voice was rough, choked with emotion. He described the job, the deli, the old man. He spoke of Vinny's recklessness and his own hesitation. He recounted the gunshot, the blood, and the prayer that haunted him. Father Luca's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His breath caught in his throat. As Antonio continued describing the location of the deli, the name of the victim, and the details of the crime, a cold realization washed over Luca like ice water. Mr. Castellano. Luca knew that name. He had known the man personally. Years ago, when Luca first returned to Brooklyn as a priest, Mr. Castellano had been one of his earliest supporters. The old man donated food to the church's soup kitchen, helped organize community events, and never missed a Sunday service. He was a good man, a kind man, and he had once told Father Luca that the church had saved him from despair after his wife died. And now he was dead, killed by one of Matteo's men. Father Luca's vision blurred. Behind the screen, Antonio couldn't see the priest's face, couldn't see the tears forming in his eyes or the way his jaw tightened. Luca wanted to scream, to demand justice, to tear the screen down and confront the man who had helped murder someone he cared about. But he couldn't. The sanctity of confession was absolute. What was said here could never leave this booth. It was a sacred trust, a promise to God. Antonio continued, his voice breaking. He spoke of his guilt, his sleepless nights, his fear of dying without absolution. He asked if God could forgive someone like him. He asked if there was any hope for a man with blood on his hands. Father Luca closed his eyes and prayed for strength. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, though his heart was anything but. He told Antonio that forgiveness was possible, but it required true repentance. It wasn't enough to feel guilt. Antonio had to make amends. He had to turn away from the life that led him here. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful. Antonio listened in silence. When Father Luca finished, the enforcer asked a question that made Luca's blood run cold. Antonio asked if the priest thought his boss, Matteo Romano, could ever be forgiven too. Father Luca sat frozen. His brother's name, spoken aloud in this sacred space, felt like a knife to the chest. Antonio didn't know. He had no idea that the priest absolving him was the brother of the man who ordered the violence, the fear, the death, and Father Luca couldn't tell him. The next 2 days were a blur of tension and dread. Antonio left the confessional feeling lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat. He began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could leave this life behind. He could disappear, start over somewhere far from Brooklyn and the Romano family. But he was wrong. Matteo Romano didn't forgive, and he never forgot. Word had reached Matteo that Antonio had been acting strangely. He'd been distant, distracted, and worst of all, he'd been asking questions. Questions about getting out, about leaving the family, about what happened to people who betrayed the code. In Matteo's world, questions were more dangerous than bullets. They were the first sign of disloyalty, and disloyalty was a cancer that had to be cut out immediately. Matteo was 43 years old with sharp features, cold gray eyes, and a presence that commanded fear. He wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and lived in a penthouse overlooking the East River. But beneath the polished exterior was a man forged in violence. He had clawed his way to the top by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than anyone else. He had enemies in every borough, rivals in every city, but none of them dared move against him. Because Matteo Romano didn't just win, he destroyed. When he learned about Antonio's confession, Matteo's jaw tightened. He had trusted Antonio, brought him into the family, given him opportunities, treated him like a brother. And this was how he was repaid? With weakness? With doubt? Matteo made a decision. Antonio had to answer for his betrayal. And he had to do it in a way that sent a message to everyone else in the organization. There was no escape. But there was a problem. Matteo had also learned where Antonio went to confess: St. Michael's Church. The same church where his estranged brother Luca served as a priest. Matteo hadn't thought about Luca in years. He had buried those memories, locked them away in a place where sentiment couldn't reach. But now, hearing that name again, something stirred inside him. Anger, resentment, curiosity. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that if Antonio had confessed to Luca, then his brother had information. Information that could be useful or dangerous. Matteo decided to handle this personally. He would go to St. Michael's, confront Antonio, and if necessary, remind his brother that blood was thicker than holy water. Meanwhile, Father Luca wrestled with his own demons. The seal of confession prevented him from acting on what he knew, but that didn't stop the guilt from eating him alive. He couldn't tell the police, he couldn't warn Mr. Castellano's family. He couldn't even confront Antonio directly. All he could do was pray and hope that Antonio would find the strength to do the right thing. But deep down, Luca knew the truth. Men like Antonio rarely escaped. And men like Matteo never let go. On the third night after Antonio's confession, Father Luca was alone in the church, lighting candles and preparing for evening prayers. The rain had returned, heavier than before, drumming against the roof like an omen. The church was empty except for him, the flickering candles casting long shadows across the walls. Then the door opened. Father Luca turned and saw a figure silhouetted against the storm. The man stepped inside, water streaming from his coat, and as he moved into the light, Luca's heart stopped. It was Matteo. His brother looked older, harder, but the eyes were the same, cold, calculating. Matteo scanned the church with the practiced gaze of a predator, and when his eyes landed on Luca, he didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if seeing a ghost was the most natural thing in the world. Matteo walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Father Luca stood frozen, his mind racing. Why was he here? What did he want? Matteo stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither brother spoke. Then Matteo broke the silence. He asked if Luca remembered him. Luca said he did. Matteo asked if Luca had heard Antonio's confession. Luca reminded him that confessions were sacred and confidential. Matteo's jaw tightened. He said he didn't care about rules or God. He cared about loyalty. And Antonio had broken it. Father Luca's heart pounded. He asked what Matteo planned to do. Matteo's answer was simple: justice. Antonio would pay for his betrayal, and if Luca tried to protect him, then Luca would pay too. Before Luca could respond, the church door opened again. This time, it was Antonio. He had come back, unable to stay away, drawn by guilt and hope and the desperate need for salvation. When he saw Matteo standing in the church, his face went pale. The hunter and the hunted stood face to face, with the priest caught between them. And in that moment, Father Luca realized that everything was about to shatter. The tension in St. Michael's Church was suffocating. Antonio stood near the entrance, frozen, his hand instinctively moving toward his waistband where he usually kept his gun. But he'd left it at home. Coming to church with a weapon had felt wrong, even for him. Now, staring at Matteo Romano, he regretted that decision. Matteo's eyes burned with cold fury. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was a death sentence. Antonio had broken the code, and in Matteo's world, there was only one punishment for betrayal. But between them stood Father Luca, his hands raised, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. He told Matteo to stop, to think, to remember that this was a house of God, a place of sanctuary and forgiveness. Matteo laughed bitterly. He asked Luca if he really believed that God cared about men like them. Men who had killed, stolen, and destroyed. He said that forgiveness was a fairy tale for people who couldn't accept the truth. The world was brutal, and only the strong survived. Antonio had become weak, and weakness had no place in the Romano family. Antonio finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his hands trembling, and admitted everything. He confessed to Matteo that he had lost his way, that the guilt was consuming him, and that he couldn't live with the blood on his hands anymore. He said he wanted out. He wanted to leave the family, leave Brooklyn, and try to find some kind of peace before it was too late. Matteo's expression didn't change. He told Antonio that there was no such thing as out. Once you were in the family, you were in for life. The only way to leave was in a coffin. Father Luca's heart raced. He knew his brother's reputation, knew what Matteo was capable of. But standing here, in this sacred space, Luca refused to let history repeat itself. He had left the life of violence years ago, but he had never stopped loving his brother. And now, faced with the possibility of losing him forever, not to death, but to the darkness, Luca made a choice. He stepped directly between Matteo and Antonio, his arms outstretched, and spoke with a conviction that echoed through the empty church. He told Matteo that this cycle of violence, loyalty built on fear and retribution without mercy, would never end, not unless someone chose to break it. He reminded Matteo of their childhood, of the moments before the family consumed them, when they were just two brothers who dreamed of something better. He asked Matteo if he ever wondered what their lives could have been if they had chosen differently. For the first time, Matteo's mask cracked. His jaw tightened, and something flickered in his eyes. Pain, regret, something buried so deep that even he had forgotten it was there. He told Luca that it was too late for him, that the choices had already been made, and there was no going back. He said that the moment Luca walked away, he had abandoned Matteo to this life alone. And now, after all these years, Luca had no right to lecture him about choices. Luca's voice softened. He admitted that he had been wrong to leave without trying harder to save his brother. He said that he had been a coward, choosing his own salvation over fighting for Matteo's. But he also said that it wasn't too late. That redemption wasn't something you earned. It was something you accepted. And if Matteo could let go of the anger, the pride, and the need for control, then maybe, just maybe, he could find peace too. Matteo stood silent, his hands clenched into fists. Behind him, Antonio watched, barely breathing. The rain outside had become a roar, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The candles flickered, their light dancing across the stone walls. Then Matteo moved. His hand reached into his coat, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Father Luca closed his eyes, ready for whatever came next. Antonio braced himself, expecting the worst. But Matteo didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a photograph. Old, creased, faded by time. It was a picture of two boys standing side by side, smiling. One was Matteo, the other was Luca. They couldn't have been more than 10 years old, arms around each other's shoulders, faces full of hope and innocence. Matteo stared at the photograph for a long time. His hands shook. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said he had carried that picture for 20 years. Through every job, every betrayal, every sleepless night. He said he didn't know why he kept it. Maybe to remind himself of what he'd lost, or maybe to remind himself why he kept going. He looked up at Luca, and for the first time in decades, Matteo's eyes weren't cold. They were human. He told Luca that he was tired. Tired of the violence, the fear, the constant war. But he didn't know how to stop. He didn't know how to be anything other than what he had become. Father Luca stepped forward and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. He told Matteo that stopping didn't mean weakness, it meant courage, and that no matter how far someone had fallen, there was always a way back. It just required the willingness to take the first step. Matteo looked at Antonio. The enforcer stood there, tears streaming down his face, waiting for judgment. Matteo took a deep breath, and then he did something no one expected. He told Antonio to leave, to disappear, to find the peace he was looking for, and he warned him never to come back to Brooklyn. Antonio didn't hesitate. He nodded, whispered a broken thank you, and ran. The church doors slammed behind him, leaving only the two brothers standing in the candlelight. Matteo turned to leave, but Father Luca called out to him. He asked if Matteo would stay, just for a moment, just to talk. Matteo stopped at the door, his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around, but he didn't leave either. And in that silence, something shifted. The rain began to soften. The candles burned brighter. And for the first time in 20 years, Matteo Romano allowed himself to wonder if forgiveness was real. 3 months later, St. Michael's Church still stood in the heart of Brooklyn, its bells ringing every Sunday morning. Father Luca continued his work, offering guidance and absolution to those who sought it. Antonio Ricci was never seen again in New York. Some said he went west, to California. Others said he went south, to start over in a small town where no one knew his name. And Matteo Romano, he didn't leave the family. Not completely, but something in him had changed. He became quieter, more deliberate. He still led, but with less cruelty and more calculation. He visited St. Michael's once a month, always at night, always alone. He never went inside. He just stood outside the doors, listening to the sound of his brother's voice leading prayers. The photograph of 2 brothers remained in his coat pocket, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there are still echoes of light. And in the confessional booth of St. Michael's Church, Father Luca continued to listen, to forgive, and to hope that one day his brother would walk through those doors and ask for the one thing he had never allowed himself to want: redemption. Thank you for experiencing this story. If you enjoyed this journey of faith, blood, and forgiveness, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that explore the complexity of the human soul. Every story is a door, and we invite you to walk through it with us. Tentar novamente. Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.
3 months had passed since that stormy night in St. Michael's Church, but the echoes of what happened there continued to reverberate through the lives of everyone involved. Brooklyn moved on, as cities always do, indifferent to the small human dramas that unfolded in its shadows. But for those who stood in that church, the priest, the enforcer, and the boss, nothing would ever be the same. Antonio Ricci disappeared the moment he left St. Michael's. He didn't go home to pack. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He simply walked into the rain-soaked night and vanished. Some of Matteo's men searched for him in the weeks that followed, more out of habit than genuine commitment. But Matteo had given the order quietly, almost reluctantly. Let him go. Word spread through the organization that Antonio had been dealt with, though no one knew exactly what that meant. In the world of organized crime, ambiguity was often more powerful than certainty. Antonio became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered in back rooms and dark alleys. The truth was simpler and more hopeful than anyone imagined. Antonio had taken a bus west, crossing state lines with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart heavy with gratitude and guilt. He ended up in a small town in Montana, a place so remote that the nearest city was 2 hours away. He found work at a lumber mill using a different name, living in a modest apartment above a hardware store. The mountains surrounded him like silent sentinels, and for the first time in his adult life, Antonio experienced something he had forgotten existed: peace. But peace didn't mean the absence of pain. Every night, Antonio knelt beside his bed and prayed. He prayed for Mr. Castellano's soul. He prayed for the old man's daughter who would never see her father again. He prayed for Vinny, who was still out there somewhere, still pulling triggers without conscience. And he prayed for Father Luca, the man who had shown him that forgiveness was possible, even for someone like him. Antonio never forgot the priest's words, spoken through that confessional screen. True repentance requires action, not just remorse. So Antonio lived simply, worked honestly, and donated half his paycheck to St. Jude's Children's Hospital in Mr. Castellano's name. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And some days, when the sun rose over the mountains and the air smelled of pine and possibility, Antonio allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was becoming a better man. Back in Brooklyn, Father Luca resumed his duties at St. Michael's Church, but the weight of that night clung to him like a second skin. The seal of confession had protected him from legal consequences, but it couldn't protect him from his own conscience. He had heard Antonio's confession, absolved him, and watched him walk away to freedom. But he hadn't been able to save Mr. Castellano. He hadn't been able to prevent the violence that took an innocent life, and he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he had failed. Father Luca threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He expanded the church's soup kitchen, organized community outreach programs, and spent long hours counseling those who sought his guidance. He visited the sick, comforted the grieving, and baptized newborns. But late at night, when the church was empty and the candles burned low, Luca would sit in the confessional booth and weep. He wept for Mr. Castellano, for Antonio, and most of all, for his brother, because Matteo had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines or altered the landscape of organized crime in Brooklyn. But Father Luca noticed. A priest learns to read souls, to see the subtle shifts in a person's spirit. And Luca saw something in Matteo that he hadn't seen in 20 years. Doubt. Matteo Romano continued to run his organization with the same efficiency and control that had made him feared throughout New York. He attended meetings, made decisions, and maintained order. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. The photograph of two young boys, one who became a priest and one who became a crime boss, remained in his coat pocket, a tangible reminder of roads not taken and choices that could still be unmade. Matteo found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. When one of his lieutenants suggested eliminating a rival who posed a minor threat, Matteo hesitated. In the past, he would have given the order without a second thought. Now, he found himself asking, is this necessary? Is there another way? His men noticed the change. They whispered about it in hushed tones, wondering if the boss was getting soft, if age was catching up to him, if the Romano Empire was beginning to crumble from within. But Matteo wasn't weak. He was thinking. For the first time in his adult life, he was considering the cost of his actions beyond immediate profit and power. Every order he gave, every threat he made, every act of violence he sanctioned, they all carried weight now. They all had faces, names, consequences that rippled outward in ways he had never bothered to consider before. And once a month, like clockwork, Matteo came to St. Michael's Church, always at night, always alone. He never went inside. He would park his black Mercedes across the street, turn off the engine and sit in the darkness, watching the light spill from the stained glass windows. Sometimes he could hear his brother's voice leading evening prayers, the words muffled but unmistakable. Matteo would close his eyes and listen, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his jaw tight with emotion he couldn't name. He told himself he was just checking on Luca, making sure his brother was safe in a neighborhood that could be dangerous. But deep down, Matteo knew the truth. He came because he needed to. Because in that church, in the presence of his brother's faith, Matteo felt something he had spent decades trying to destroy: hope. One cold December night, 6 months after their confrontation, Matteo arrived at St. Michael's earlier than usual. The church was still lit, and through the windows he could see his brother moving between the pews, straightening hymnals and extinguishing candles. Matteo watched for a long time, his breath fogging the windshield, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar sensation. Fear. Not the fear of enemies or arrest, but the fear of vulnerability. The fear of opening a door that had been locked for so long, he had forgotten what lay behind it. His hand moved to the door handle. He almost pulled it, almost stepped out of the car and walked across that street, through those heavy wooden doors, and into the presence of the brother he had abandoned. But at the last moment, courage failed him. Matteo released the handle, started the engine, and drove away into the night. Father Luca had seen him. Through the stained glass window, he had caught a glimpse of the black Mercedes, had recognized the silhouette sitting inside. His heart had leapt with hope, thinking that tonight might be the night Matteo finally came inside. But when the car drove away, Luca felt a crushing disappointment. Still, he didn't despair. He had learned patience in his years as a priest. He had learned that redemption wasn't a single moment, but a journey, often slow and painful, marked by false starts and setbacks. So Father Luca did the only thing he could do. He knelt before the altar, clasped his hands together, and prayed. He prayed for Antonio wherever he was, that he would find the peace he sought. He prayed for Mr. Castellano's family, that they would find comfort in their grief. And he prayed for Matteo, his brother, that one day he would find the courage to step through those doors and accept the forgiveness that had been waiting for him all along. Outside, the Brooklyn night settled over the city like a blanket. The streets glowed with streetlights and neon signs. Sirens wailed in the distance. Life continued, indifferent and relentless. But inside St. Michael's Church, the candles burned steadily, their flames unwavering in the darkness. And the bells, ancient and patient, waited to ring again. Not just to mark the passing hours, but to celebrate the return of a lost soul, because Father Luca believed with every fiber of his being that Matteo would come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. And when that day came, Luca would be waiting, not with judgment or condemnation, but with open arms and the simple, powerful truth that had guided his entire life. No one is beyond redemption. No sin is too great for forgiveness, and no soul is ever truly lost as long as there is someone willing to light a candle and wait in the darkness. The photograph in Matteo's pocket remained there, creased and fading, but never forgotten. Two brothers, frozen in time, their arms around each other, their smiles innocent and untainted by the violence that would later define their lives. It was a promise, a memory. A roadmap back to something that had been lost but never destroyed. And somewhere in Montana, Antonio Ricci looked up at the stars and whispered a prayer of thanks. For the priest who had shown him mercy, for the boss who had let him live, and for the chance, however slim, to become the man he had always wanted to be, but never had the courage to pursue. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang in the night, their sound carrying across Brooklyn, reaching into the darkness where broken men searched for light. And in that sound, there was hope. Thank you for joining us on this profound journey through guilt, faith, and the possibility of redemption. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make and the roads we travel, please subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you new stories that explore the depths of the human experience, tales of struggle, courage, and the relentless search for meaning in a complicated world. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and walk with us through the next chapter. Because every story matters, and yours might be next.